School of Economics. I broadcast from Kiev, where I stay now, together with my family. This has been almost a month of terrible invasion, and unfortunately, this war attacked not only our army or civilians. This war also attacked knowledge. The campuses of universities are targeted, they're bombed. A lot of students and academics are displaced or migrants. So that's why at Kyiv School of Economics, we decided to initiate this series of solidarity lectures to show that we, members of academia, are resilient and we stay strong together in solidarity with our friends and colleagues from Ukrainian universities. And we are inviting leading intellectuals from world universities to discuss what is happening now with Ukraine and Russia, but also what happened in history of our region. And today we have a very special guest, Marie Sarotte. She is an expert in the history of international relations. She is a distinguished professor of historical studies at Johns Hopkins University, but she's also a research associate at Harvard University. She has written many books about the history of our region after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Her books received international awards and recognition in many countries. And today we are especially lucky to have her because we will be talking about her most recent book, which is Not 1 Inch, America, Russia, and the Making of Post-Cold War Stalemate. And this book covers a long process of how both Washington and Moscow constructed and responded to the NATO expansion. And I think this topic is very relevant today to many people in Ukraine and Russia in the West. And perhaps her lecture can help us to contextualize what is happening now in deeper historical and political context. So, Mary, thank you very much for being with us. This is of course, a great honor for us, and I will pass this virtual floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Of course, I have to thank you for the honor of speaking to you, and I have to express my admiration for you and for the Ukrainian people for the heroism that you have shown in the face of this tragic Russian invasion. The entire world is talking about its admiration for Ukraine. And so it really is an honor to be asked to speak to you as part of this series of solidarity lectures. My understanding, I offered to do question and answer. I offered to do whatever you said. And my understanding from you is you would actually welcome the distraction of a lecture with some slides. So I have put together some PowerPoint slides, but of course you should feel free to interrupt me and ask questions so we can make this a conversation. And then we can also take questions at the end as well. So let me just share those, the slides. And are you seeing the slides now?
I see them, but they're not in full screen.
They're not in full screen. Okay, actually, hold on just a second. Let me try that again and see what I can do here. Let me try this again. All right. I've got that open and ready to go. Let me try this again. Share screen. All right, play from start. Are they showing properly now?
Yes, everything is fine now.
Great. All right, well, thank you very much. This is, of course, your lovely promotional slide. I'm very impressed in the middle of a war that you are able to do lovely promotional material. So it's wonderful to be able to talk to you. As you said, I'm a professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C. And as you requested, I'll talk about my new book, which is called Not 1 Inch, America, Russia, and the Making of Post-Cold War Stalemate. I also wanted to just add, with the help of my friend Serhiy Plokhy at Harvard, a phrase in Ukrainian. I will try to say it. Please forgive my pronunciation. Dla меня велика честь выступити сегодня перед вами. How did I do?
Excellent. Thank you very much. It's an honor
Sure.
to host you for us.
Excellent. All right. Thank you for forgiving my bad pronunciation. All right. So since you requested it, here we go. Post-Cold War history. So at the end of 1989, it seemed that a new era of harmony in both transatlantic and US-Russian relations had dawned. But now, more than 30 years after Soviet collapse in December 1991, there is a major land war in Europe again. Of course, I don't need to tell you the brutal Russian invasion of your land. And one of Putin's many grievances is NATO expansion. It's not the only one. Of course, he has said many crazy things about how Ukraine belongs to him. So I'm not arguing this is the only issue going on, but it is one of the issues that he has been complaining about. So let's take a minute and talk about the history of why and how NATO expanded. And what were the origins of this? And was there a promise, for example, that it would not happen, since this is a regular controversy that comes up? And what did NATO expansion do to US-Russian relations after the collapse of the Soviet Union 30 years ago? So these are the questions that I'll be talking about today. Now, let me just provide a little bit of context for your audience. I have been working on the history of the end of the Cold War for a long time. So I'll tell you a little bit about my previous work, and then I'll summarize the argument of my most recent book briefly about Soviet collapse and what I call the ratchet turns. I'll explain what those are, and then finally talk a little bit about the legacy. So on my previous work, I became interested in the subject because I was studying abroad in West Berlin in 1989. And as a young student, I got to see the collapse of Soviet power basically from a front row seat. And I became fascinated by that and wanted to know in historical terms what the events were that led up to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of Soviet power in Europe. You see here a picture from the night of November 9th, 1989, the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. This was the night that the Berlin Wall unexpectedly opened. At this particular location, there's not even a border crossing point, so people are literally climbing onto the wall to go over it. In the front of the picture is West Berlin, and on the far side of the picture behind the gate is East Berlin, and people are basically going back and forth. So I actually have written a trilogy of books on the end of the Cold War. I did not know at the beginning that I would be writing a trilogy, but one question kept giving way to another question. New evidence kept becoming available. I am, of course, a historian, so I need to work in new evidence. And I kept finding new opportunities to think and to write. So I ended up writing 3 books, although I didn't expect it. I've written a book called The Collapse, the Accidental Opening of the Berlin Wall. It's about the amazing events that created that opening, which was not planned. And if you like, we can also talk in more detail about that. I then wrote I wrote another book. I actually wrote these books in reverse order, but in terms of chronological events, this is next. This book, 1989, and the struggle to create post-Cold War Europe. This is about the time after the wall came down, and as the subtitle suggests, the struggle to create a new kind of post-Cold War order, and in particular to unify Germany. So this book goes in detail on the basis of evidence from multiple countries, goes into detail on the process of how Germany was unified. And that, of course, was tricky because Germany had, at the end of World War II in 1945, had surrendered unconditionally. And unconditionally means unconditionally. There were no limits. So still in 1999, 1990, the victor powers from World War II, which were the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, still had legal rights over and troops in divided Germany. And that all had to be sorted out in order for Germany to unify. Now, for the Western powers, they had already set up NATO together with West Germany. So their troops already had a different justification for being there. But the presence of the Soviet troops basically still went back to this unconditional surrender. And so in order for Germany to unify, Moscow had to be convinced to give up both those troops and their legal rights. And this is how we get to the new book that I've written about Not 1 Inch. Now, Mikhail Gorbachev has said of this time period in early 1990, when Germany is trying to unify, He has said in the year 2014, which was the 25th anniversary of the wall coming down, the topic of NATO expansion was not discussed at all. Not a single East European country raised the issue. Western leaders didn't bring it up either. So don't portray Gorbachev. He is here referring to himself in the third person. So this is Gorbachev talking about himself. So don't portray Gorbachev and the then Soviet authorities as naive people who were wrapped around the West's finger. Again, this is what Mikhail Gorbachev says about himself and about 1990 in the year 2014. The problem is that Gorbachev 2014 disagrees with Gorbachev in the year 1990. It's clear from the historical evidence that this issue, this question of what would happen to NATO after Germany unified, did come up and specifically came up in conversations with Gorbachev. There's multiple sources from multiple countries that show this, including Gorbachev's own notes, which are in the Gorbachev Foundation in Moscow. So here is one of Gorbachev's own notes from 1990, where he says, quote, "I told Baker, we are aware of your favorable attitude toward the intention expressed by a number of representatives of East European countries to withdraw from the Warsaw Pact in order to join NATO later." This is Mikhail Gorbachev's own notes. So he knows that NATO expansion is coming up, and he even knows that it involves not just East Germany, but also Central and Eastern European countries that may later want to join NATO. And so despite what Gorbachev says later, this issue is very much part of the events of 1990. And again, as I said, my new book is based on archival work in 6 countries, in France, in Germany, in Poland, in Russia, in the UK, and in the US. And then in some of those countries, I went to multiple cities, particularly in Germany, to research both the first 2 books and then my new book, Not 1 Inch. And so I also did interviews. I did more than 100 interviews because, of course, not everything is written down. But I did follow a hierarchy of evidence. So if there was a situation like the one where I just described, where there was a difference between what someone said 30 years later and what the documents from the time showed, I, of course, went with the documents from the time. Because when you have an interview 30 years later, first of all, people can just forget things, number one. But number two, they also have an understanding of how things turned out and might have a reason to change how they describe events. Whereas from the documents written at the time, you get a sense of what people thought before they knew the outcomes of the events. So I relied most heavily on archives from the time period. I should also add that I learned when I did my PhD in history at Yale to enter the past through as many portals as possible. In other words, I don't just use documents. As I said, I also do interviews, but I also look at sound recordings, video recordings, television broadcasts, because often I don't need to tell you this, in a crisis situation, people can't stop and write things down, but they might see things, they might take pictures of it, particularly now cell phone photos. So the more recent the history I work on, the more I need to look for evidence beyond written documents. I also need to look for images and so forth. So I know that you are going through awful and tragic times there. The more that you can document them and capture them in images, the greater help it will be to the rest of the world to understand what you are going through and to help you and hopefully administer justice when I very much hope a day can come. And the more evidence that is there, the greater the chances that that will happen. So when I looked at this history, as I said, I was first interested in the history of the wall coming down, and then I was interested in the history of Germany unifying. It became clear to me that from Gorbachev sources and others, that history was closely related to the history of NATO enlargement. And when you look at images like this map, it becomes clear that it can hardly be otherwise. This is a map of the Cold War. The countries in green are NATO members. The countries in orange are Warsaw Pact members. For the younger audience members, that was the Soviet Union's military alliance. It was an involuntary one in contrast to NATO. And as you can see, the front line between NATO and the Warsaw Pact runs through the middle of divided Germany. So once the wall comes down, once it's clear Germans want to unify, The West has to figure out, what will the Soviet Union want to give up East Germany? And as part of that, there are hypothetical discussions early on between the American Secretary of State, James Baker, and the last Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, about the future of NATO. And James Baker in February 1990 does make a hypothetical remark. He says, how about this? And this is speculative, and it's phrased in the form of a question. He says, how about this? How about, Mikhail Gorbachev, you let your part of Germany go, and we in the West agree that NATO will move not 1 inch eastward. And I can document from multiple sources that that conversation took place. So there are some people generally in my country who say that conversation never happened. That is incorrect. The conversation does happen. It's important to remember, however, that it is a speculative conversation. There is no formal agreement that results from it. And when the US Secretary of State, Jim Baker, goes home to his boss and old friend, President George H.W. Bush, and explains this to President Bush says to Jim Baker, no, that is not right. That is not my policy, and I am the President of the United States. The problem with that is if we say that NATO will forever stay frozen where it is on this map that I'm showing you right now, that would mean a united Germany will be half in and half out of NATO, and that makes no sense. Also, there's no reason we need to offer this because Moscow is not demanding it. So we don't have to give this away. And I, George H.W. Bush, I think NATO has been a big success. I think it has contributed to stability in Europe. I think we should not only keep NATO, but we should keep its ability to enlarge or expand, starting with East Germany. And so James Baker had to quickly write back to his allies and say, sorry, what I said was not accurate. It's causing confusion. We're not going to say that anymore. And so he immediately stopped saying that. The problem is that it takes Moscow a while to notice. And Putin now today is instrumentalizing this hypothetical discussion about not 1 inch, saying it wasn't just a hypothetical discussion. It was a promise. It was a pledge. And the West has violated it, and somehow that justifies, what he is currently doing to your country. I find that stomach turning. It in no way justifies what he is doing, and it is not even historically accurate. Now, of course, Putin doesn't really care about historical accuracy. He's caring about justifications to the Russian people for what he is doing to you. But just in historical terms, it is not accurate, because as the negotiations go on over German unification, what becomes clear is that Bush is, maintaining a hard line on this. The United States does not, as the negotiations move toward closure, does not offer a pledge about NATO's non-expansion. Instead, it takes on a different strategy. And this strategy is best described by Bob Gates, who is later the American Defense Secretary, but in 1990 was the Deputy National Security Advisor to President George H.W. Bush. And Bob Gates said our strategy was bribing the Soviets out, bribing the Soviets out. In other words, we're going to buy them out with money, and even better, the West Germans are the ones who are going to pay the bribe because they are the ones who care the most about their unification. So this is what happens. The final settlement on the unification of Germany, which is signed in September 1990, does not include any kind of pledge about NATO. In fact, it includes the opposite. That treaty expressly allows NATO to expand its Article 5 across the Cold War line that you see in the middle of this map and into Eastern Germany. Article 5 is, of course, as you know, the heart of the treaty. It's the article that specifies an attack on one member state will be treated as an attack on all member states. It's really the core of being in NATO. And the final settlement on Germany explicitly allowed NATO to move eastward many inches beyond that Cold War line and expand in East Germany. Putin, of course, never mentions this. This never comes up, right? He just sticks to the earlier hypothetical discussion. But Moscow authorized signature of that treaty in exchange for a large amount of financial support from West Germany. So that is the legal position. So the net result then is that despite all of the dramatic upheavals of the revolutions of 1989, that there were actually relatively few changes to the structure of European security. It had been dominated by NATO before, and it would be dominated by NATO afterwards. And so in some ways you had a little bit of a disconnect, which is that there were these protest movements, the ones that had in Poland been led by Solidarity, that in East Germany had brought the wall down. Those movements were pressing for a new world, but a new world order did not emerge to match it. And instead, you had a lot of continuity from the Cold War order, such as the perpetuation of NATO. Now, in some ways, this is not surprising. As academics, as political scientists, scholars know that institutions are what we say in English, that they are sticky, meaning that they endure. Once you have an institution like NATO, its most likely outcome is to persist and to endure. So it is not surprising that this happened. What was surprising was President George H.W. Bush's ability to label this a new world order, since it was not. So you had a lot of Cold War continuity with NATO persisting and this disconnect. So I wanted to look into this disconnect between the public rhetoric in Washington about a new world order and the fact that Washington actually perpetuated pre-existing or prefabricated Cold War institutions into the post-Cold War era, most importantly, NATO. And so in the earlier books in my trilogy, I looked into that. And I looked into, as I said, this question that I've just described to you of whether or not there was a broken promise. There was not, in my opinion. It did come up, but it was not a broken promise. And I've written about this for Foreign Affairs and elsewhere. And then for this new book, Not One Inch, I wanted to look at the consequences in the 1990s and the Clinton era of this decision that I refer to as prefab, meaning prefabricated institutions from the Cold War being carried over into the post-Cold War period. And the problem for that is that there was then a successive limiting or ratcheting down of options for European security. And I'll explain in a minute what I mean by this. And once again, I got documents declassified, went to multiple locations. I got documents declassified from the Bill Clinton Presidential Library, the Defense Department, the State Department, and I worked in foreign collections as well. Sometimes I had to place appeals for these documents. In particular, I worked with the Clinton Library, and it took me 3 years, but I got nearly all transcripts of summits between President Bill Clinton, shown here on the right, and Russian President Boris Yeltsin, shown here on the left. I got nearly all of the documents associated with their summits declassified. They met 18 times, more than any other Soviet or Russian leader and American president before or since. Clinton went to Russia more times than any other American president before or since. And so there is quite an extensive written record from all of those meetings. Now, I had to go through an appeal, so it took me 3 years to actually get these documents. And I did win that appeal, and I was amazed because in 2018, in August 2018, when I won this appeal, the Kremlin complained. So Russian presidential spokesman Dmitry Peskov complained about the release of my declassification. His justification was apparently that he was opposed to documents on currently serving politicians being released, by which he, of course, meant his boss, because his boss, of course, worked for Boris Yeltsin. And there were quite a few records about Putin in the documents that I got declassified. And those are now, by the way, freely available on the Clinton Archive website. It was, as I said, this was covered in the New Yorker. Masha Gessen wrote an article about this declassification. And there are a whole host of records on the website if you would like to look at them, together with the National Security Archive, my friends Svetlana Savranskaya and Tom Blanton, who might also be very good speakers for this series, by the way. I put a selection of these documents onto the National Security Archive website. This is just a small selection. But again, if you are interested, go to the National Security Archive website and type in my name, and this will come up. Or go to the Clinton website itself and you can see these documents, because the rule is that once someone like me gets these documents declassified, they are then open for everyone. So they are open to the whole world. So if you are interested, you should feel free to go and look at these documents and or at the summary of some of them that I put together with Svetlana and Tom. Svetlana and Tom, I should say, have continued declassification work, and they have gotten a number of documents specifically related to Clinton and Putin's contacts declassified as well. So there is a huge amount on the internet available for everyone if you would like to look into any of these topics for yourself. So let me just talk very briefly about the argument of my new book, and then we will get going on questions. So in the book, I look at in detail. First, I talk about the wall coming down and German unification, just as I described to you. And then I look at the 1990s. You see here, of course, a famous picture of Moscow in 1991, when Soviet leader Boris Yeltsin successfully resisted a coup to restore Soviet centralized authority in August 1991. The Soviet Union instead, of course, collapses, as you all know. I don't need to tell you that. August 1991, there's a coup by hardliners. The goal is to oust Gorbachev and restore centralized control by the Communist Party. The coup fails, but it emboldens Yeltsin. And in December 1991, of course, your state, Ukraine, declares independence. Together with your state in Belarus, Yeltsin declares that Russia will also become independent and that the Soviet Union will, as a result, dissolve. So much of what happens is driven by both your state and by Boris Yeltsin. In the case of Boris Yeltsin, that is very much inspired by his hatred for Mikhail Gorbachev. The two men had long been bitter rivals, and Yeltsin had realized in December 1991 that following the Ukrainian example, becoming independent, that would destroy the Soviet Union. At that point, Mikhail Gorbachev was president of the Soviet Union. If Yeltsin could destroy the Soviet Union, that would leave Gorbachev as president of nothing. And it would basically take all power away from Gorbachev, which Yeltsin wanted to do, because Yeltsin could then, of course, be the leader of an independent Russian state. So Yeltsin is very much seizing upon your country's declaration of independence to really push events to the limit and to dissolve the Soviet Union. And Gorbachev realizes that Yeltsin has won. He resigns on December 25th, 1991, and the Soviet Union ceases to exist. But as my friend Serhiy Plokhy has written, Serhiy, who provided that translation at the beginning, it is a mistake to regard the collapse of the Soviet Union as an event that happened on one day. As you know, Moscow does not let go of its empire that quickly. Empires do not die quick deaths. They die long, messy, protracted deaths. And so, as Serhiy Plokhy has written, the collapse of the Soviet Union was not an event, but a process. And it is sadly still ongoing, and you are tragically experiencing some of its, Moscow's final violent attempts to take control of more territory than it actually was able to hold on to at the end of the Cold War. So I talk about in the book that there were three moments which I refer to as ratchet turns that were decisive in the decision to expand NATO. Now, a ratchet is a tool that turns in one direction only. So the point about a ratchet is once you've turned it, you don't go back, right? You no longer have that option to go back. So I liked that image of the ratchet turn in one direction only, because that to me helped me understand how NATO had enlarged. So the first ratchet turn, as I've already described, was by President George H.W. Bush in 1990. That was his decision to maintain not only NATO, but also its ability to move beyond the Cold War line. And as I said, I refer to this as the success of prefabricated institutions, or the stickiness of pre-existing institutions. Then there was a second ratchet turn in 1993 under President Bill Clinton, because President George H.W. Bush lost the American presidential election in 1992, so it was up to Clinton to deal with the consequences. And initially, when President Clinton came into office, he was hesitant about NATO expansion because, and this was amazing to me, because of Ukraine and post-Soviet states. He said to his European allies, he said, we've just erased the Cold War line across Europe between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. But if I just expand NATO right away, it's only going to go in the first instance to Central and Eastern Europe. And that will leave Ukraine on the wrong side of the line, and it will leave other post-Soviet states on the wrong side of the line. And I believe, this is President Clinton speaking, I believe Ukraine is the linchpin of peace in Europe, and I don't want to do that. And I was amazed reading this, from 1994 at how prescient this was. And so he said, let's find a different way to enlarge NATO. Because, and this is one of the important arguments in my book, NATO enlargement was not one thing. there were multiple ways to enlarge NATO known at the time. And so Clinton initially favored a policy that I think was very smart called the Partnership for Peace. The idea there is, instead of drawing, as President Clinton put it, a new line across Europe between the countries that had Article 5 and the countries that didn't, that he would instead blur that line. In other words, he would create an intermediate institution, the Partnership for Peace, and it would intentionally be vague how that institution, the partnership, connected to NATO membership. That was intentionally left vague. And the idea there is that all of the new states of post-Cold War Europe can join. Poland, Hungary, Romania, Ukraine, Georgia, they can all join, and they can be part of this partnership, and Russia. And then gradually, states within the partnership can be promoted one by one to NATO membership, but it will happen in a piecemeal fashion. There won't immediately be a new line across Europe that leaves the post-Soviet states on the wrong side of the line. And that, I think, was a very smart strategy. The problem is that, in large part because of Moscow's aggression towards Chechnya, Clinton changes his mind. And so in late 1994 or early 1995 is the third ratchet turn. And as I said, this is largely driven by Moscow's decision to resume bloodshed. This had already started. Yeltsin had already attacked his political opponents violently in Moscow in late 1993. But then in 1994, he, of course, authorized a brutal invasion of Chechnya. And that caused Central and East Europeans to say, you know, actually, this partnership is not going to be enough for us. The Poles, for example, had been willing to accept the partnership because they understood what Clinton was saying about your country, about Ukraine. But by late 1994, they started saying, no, 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 if Russia is invading cities again, that is not enough. We need Article 5. We need to have this Article 5 line. There's also a domestic election in the United States where the Republican Party, in a contract with America, that's a campaign platform, says we should be giving Article 5 to countries sooner. So largely because of the bloodshed in Chechnya, Clinton changes his mind and then does what he said he didn't want to do, which is to draw a new line across Europe and to give Article 5 only to a selected number of countries. So the Partnership for Peace, abbreviated here PFP, had that advantage of avoiding a new front line across Europe, but now President Clinton decides that he does need that new front line. The Partnership for Peace would have been a stepping stone to full membership at some later date. As Clinton's first Secretary of Defense, Les Aspin, put it, the partnership put NATO expansion at the end rather than at the beginning of a long-term process. Again, President Clinton now gave this up. The Partnership for Peace also had the potential to become a pan-European security institution, which many European leaders had sought after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and one which had managed to define a place in European security for Ukraine, for your country, which, as I said, was a surprisingly important factor to President Clinton. And I have here one of his quotations where he said, and this is 1994, he said, if Ukraine collapses because of Russian influence or because of militant nationalists within Ukraine or any other reason, it would undermine the whole theory of NATO's Partnership for Peace, this idea of a partnership for all of Europe. Ukraine is the linchpin of the whole idea. So Ukraine was hugely important to President Clinton in 1994. And as I said, he told Central and Eastern European countries that he preferred the Partnership for Peace to NATO expansion because it, quote, does not draw another line dividing Europe a few hundred miles to the east of the old line. Again, Ukraine kept coming up. The latter point was particularly important because Ukraine especially does not want to be pushed back into Russia's orbit. So again, this is all very present in the discussion behind closed doors at the presidential level in the 1990s. And he told the Central and Eastern Europeans this. He said, of all countries in the world, the Central and Eastern European countries, Poland, Hungary, what was Czechoslovakia, should understand the damage of dividing lines, of pushing former Soviet republics into Russia's orbit. So the problem is that, as I said, after the invasion of Chechnya, it became much harder to say that there was a possibility for pan-European peace. And the American National Security Council in particular, members of that began saying, you know, we need neo-containment of Russia. We're not going to talk about this now in the 1990s, this insurance policy or strategic hedge rationale, the neo-containment of Russia, we'll keep that in the background. In public, we're not going to rule out the possibility that Russia could join NATO, but we are going to move to start expanding NATO. And this then becomes the official US position at a meeting in December 21st, 1994. This is the President Clinton, the Vice President, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, and his deputy. This is a key meeting, and I got the handwritten documents declassified from it. At the top, it says meeting with President on NATO and Russia, December 21, 1994. So this is a photo of one of the documents that I got declassified as part of those appeals to the Clinton Library. And the upshot is that Gore said, the truth is we have conflicting impulses with regard to Central and Eastern European and the Russians. We can't prioritize both at the same time. And tragically, of course, Ukraine then ends up getting left on the wrong side of the line after there's a decision to go ahead with full guarantee Article 5 expansion in a 4 to 5 year time frame. Although, as the Secretary of State added, I can't see any of us saying this in public. And so Strobe Talbot also is, by this point, he's the presidential advisor on Russia, is very strongly in favor of NATO expansion as well, after some earlier ambiguity. He said, at the end of the Cold War, we and the Soviet Union didn't meet each other halfway, and we and Russia aren't going to do so either. So Russia is either going to just understand what we're doing and come our way, or it's not, in which case it's going to founder as the Soviet Union did. And again, this is Strobe Talbot. The American strategy should be, quote, intended to make sure that the rickety, leaking, oversized, cannon-laden good ship Russia, with its stinking bilge, its erratic autocratic captain, and its semi-mutinous crew, has a clearly visible point on the horizon to steer by. Now, here he is referring to Yeltsin. And that visible point should be the West or the United States. So this is Talbot's take on Russia in the 1990s. So let me just wrap up very quickly. Actually, let me skip out a couple slides because I would like to get to the questions. I would like to get to some images that I have for you. So you have this decision to extend Article 5 and to draw a new line across Europe, which President Clinton said he didn't want to do. You see here a map of NATO expansion, and obviously your country is not Article 5 territory. I have another similar image. This is actually from my book, Not 1 Inch. It is a similar map showing the 30 member states of NATO as of the year 2020, which of course tragically does not include your country. And I also have a map in my book from the year 1994. Now, this is a different map. This is a map without an obvious line running down through it. This was a map put together by the German Foreign Office in 1994, and it showed the dominant institutions at that time: the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, the North Atlantic Cooperation Council, which was another NATO organization, NATO itself, and the Partnership for Peace. And when I saw this map in my research, again, this is from the year 1994, I found this very sad because this was a vision of a different future. As you can see, this is a Europe that does not have a line down the middle of it, and where your country is in the middle of a Europe that is united in a host of overlapping organizations rather than behind a line. And I just was very sad to see this because it looked to me like a timeline to a better future than we are on now. And so I came to the conclusion that the problem with NATO enlargement was not enlargement itself. I think that the new democracies that arose after the collapse of the Soviet Union, including, of course, yours, had every right to decide for themselves whether or not they wanted to apply for NATO membership, and NATO had every right to decide whether or not to take them. So I'm not opposed to NATO enlargement. I think the problem was how it happened, because it happened in a way that maximized friction and confrontation and drew a new line, which left you on the wrong side of that line. And so I look back to this moment in 1994 and to this map and to the Partnership for Peace, and I wish very much that this had been the way that Europe had proceeded into the future. Now, obviously, it's always hard to say in counterfactuals, what would happen, but obviously is endlessly tragic what is happening to you now. And I wish that there had been a way to come forward from the post-Cold War moment that would not have left you in the horrible situation that you are in today. So that is that's the end of my remarks, and I would be happy to take questions or discuss any of this with you. Let me just stop sharing my screen so I can see everyone properly and let us, start discussing. So I hope that that was interesting and relevant to you.
Oh, absolutely. That was super interesting. And, you talked in great detail about the historical context, but also you mentioned so many interesting tiny details about how you actually performed your research and all the appeals you have gone through. I think all these details, they make a huge difference. It was very interesting to listen, and also to even to see some of the documents which you showed. So I noticed that the questions are gathering in the chat. I will first ask my own question, and I will give more time for people to post their questions, and then I will read them. So my first question would be the following. So you said quite eloquently about stickiness of institutions, that institutions, they reproduce each other. And my question would be, to what extent this narrative, which, as you mentioned, Putin now is using to justify the invasion, to what extent this narrative is sticky? Do you think that it was kind of some sort of a narrative that was produced by Russian elites and then it was inherited by next generations? Maybe it was even installed in some sort of a formal education that so many, people accepted this narrative and then started using it for justification? Or do you think that it's just, it was abandoned for a while and then Putin just used it only now, kind of rediscovering it yet again? So, I hope this question makes sense.
So you mean the narrative that there was a broken promise about NATO expansion? Just to make sure I understand your question. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So obviously, Western relations with Russia have gone through various phases where they were better or worse. And so at times when relations between the West and Moscow were better, so for example, immediately after the tragic September 11th attacks, 2001, Moscow expressed, sympathy to the United States. There were other high points. There was the signing of a nuclear agreement when Russia was under President Medvedev in 2010. So the U.S.-Russian relation has not been in continual decline since the end of the Cold War. But if you look at the trend overall, if you look at the trend in aggregate, the trend has been decline from a high point of about 1992, when President George H.W. Bush and Boris Yeltsin celebrated the end of the Cold War. The overall trend has been negative. And at times when it's been particularly tense, then this issue does come up. And it came up continually. So President Yeltsin would bring it up in the 90s. And then Putin would bring it up quietly, but it was really starting after the color revolutions that he started to prioritize it when speaking to American leaders. And then, of course, in recent years, he's really been instrumentalizing this history tragically to justify the way he is brutalizing your country. So complaints about NATO enlargement have been present in the interactions at the very top level between American presidents and Soviet or Russian leaders throughout the period since the wall came down. It's just sometimes they're louder, more prominent, and sometimes not. Now, of course, right now, Putin is relying very heavily on them. And as I said in my talk, he's instrumentalizing certain parts of the narrative and ignoring other parts to justify what he is doing to your country, which of course cannot be justified. So for me, as a historian of this period, it is in some ways heartbreaking to see how this history is being first manipulated and then second used to justify what is happening. So that narrative is present throughout. What's become apparent actually in the past couple of months is that there are in essence two particular controversies. There's the 1990 controversy about not 1 inch, which I described already, but there's another controversy, which is 1997. And that emerged because President Putin in December had the Russian Foreign Ministry publish and distribute these two draft treaties, one for Washington and one for NATO. And this was very unusual. Usually treaties are negotiated, they're not just distributed. But the Russian Foreign Ministry distributed these treaties. They're actually drawn up in the form that you would usually draw up a document at the end of negotiations when you are about to apply your ink to the paper for a signature. So there were literally signature lines, even though the document had not been negotiated in any way. And in that treaty, one of the terms that Putin was trying to impose on NATO was that NATO troops would go back to where they were on May 27th, 1997, which was the date of the signing of the NATO-Russia Founding Act. And the controversy or debate there was that the NATO-Russia Founding Act, in Putin's eyes, should have given Russia a veto over NATO expansion. Now, the NATO-Russia Founding Act did not do that, but Boris Yeltsin, after the signing of that act, mistakenly said in public and repeated press conferences that it was a veto. Americans and the Western powers were very upset about this, and they contacted the foreign minister and said, why is Yeltsin saying this? This is not true. And the Russian foreign minister said, Yeltsin, we can't control him, he drinks. And so Yeltsin created this public sense that Russia got a veto over NATO expansion on May 27th, 1997, which it did not, again, in the legal document. But Putin is also instrumentalizing this as well and saying, look, in 1990, we were told not 1 inch, and that's a broken promise. In 1997, we were told we got a veto, and that's now broken too. We cannot trust the West, therefore I have to, demilitarize Ukraine. And he doesn't, as I said, care about historical accuracy, but he is drawing on these two moments tragically to justify the war.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And there is one question in the chat, which I think is a sort of a follow-up question to the story which you just said. So one gentleman, Mikhailo Leveruk, he's interested in this idea that Russia itself, in some moment of history, there was a possibility for Russia to join NATO. So he wants you to reflect on that and comment that. So were there any possibilities of Russia accession to NATO in the 90s, or the possibility of transforming NATO into some another security project that would include Russia?
Yeah, so this was under debate. The first person to propose putting not Russia, but the Soviet Union into NATO was actually Mikhail Gorbachev. This was another surprise of my research going through the original documents from the time. Already in the spring of 1990, Mikhail Gorbachev, as he realized he was no longer able to get that not 1 inch promise in any formal way, he then tried a new approach. He said, how about this? He said, how about we merge NATO and the Warsaw Pact and instantly create pan-European security? And he said this to Secretary of State James Baker, the American Secretary of State. And James Baker said, no, that's not going to happen. And then Mikhail Gorbachev said, how about we put the Soviet Union in NATO then? You're saying that NATO is going to be, available to these, countries, to new democracies. That's going to be us. And Baker said that's a fantasy, that's not going to happen. And Gorbachev kept pressing. He said, this is not a fantasy. We were allies before during World War II. Why can't we be allies again? And Baker had to keep saying, no, that is just not going to happen. So Baker made it clear that there was no place in NATO for the Soviet Union. Then, of course, you have Soviet collapse, and then you have Boris Yeltsin. And the discussion comes up again, and Yeltsin talks to Bush and Clinton. And at one point, he even says, the problem with Russia joining NATO, he's saying this in expectation that it's going to happen, the problem is going to be China, because China is not going to like having a border with a NATO state. So before this happens, we'll have to think very carefully about how we will handle China. So there is this discussion, but then as in Russia, the democratization starts to fail. The corruption becomes apparent, particularly the very corrupt way that national industries are privatized. And again, as Yeltsin decides to shed the blood of his political opponents. So first, he has the army tanks fire on the parliament in October 93. He then starts this bloody war in Chechnya in 94. There's this sense in the West that Russia is failing to transition to democracy, to the rule of law, that Russia is not reliable, and that Moscow is reverting to its old form, and that is not acceptable. So even though there's never a moment where the Americans just say, Russia, you will never be in NATO, by the invasion of Chechnya, which I really cannot emphasize enough how important that was for Western thinking, there starts to be a quiet sense that it's never going to happen. And I even found an interesting document, a discussion between the Americans and the French, who were at that point held the presidency of the European Union. The French saying by 95, I believe it was, it's in my book, saying, we are never going to let Russia in the European Union. It is not going to happen. So you have this quiet sense by about 95 that Russia is failing to transition, is not going to be a candidate to join Western institutions, even though there's never really a moment where Paris or Washington just says that publicly. That is internally behind closed doors, the sense. So from that point on, it's not really a possibility, whereas it had at least been in discussion under Yeltsin.
Yeah, no, that's almost shocking. I don't know, maybe I'm just a very ignorant person, but to learn that Gorbachev himself wanted to pursue the idea of including Soviet Union to NATO sounds well, at least very interesting today. Yeah, from
now I should qualify that by saying Gorbachev, of course, was at the head of a state that was falling apart economically, that states like yours, republics like yours wanted to pull out of. So his position was weak and he had many opponents. So the interesting question is, if Baker, when Gorbachev said, let's put the Soviet Union in NATO, if Baker had said, great, sure, why not? The interesting question is, would that have been possible? Could he even have carried that out? I don't know. But the idea was in discussion already in the spring of 1990 between Gorbachev and Baker.
Wow. And there is another question in the chat by Yevgen Monastyrsky.
Yeah.
So you focused and you talked quite a lot about the 90s and Chechnya and then early 2000s, but Yevgen is interested in rather late 2000s. So what happened there? What was about not granting Ukraine action plan for NATO membership?
Right,
and he says, was George W. Bush less interested in NATO enlargement than his father?
Okay, yeah, interesting question. Yeah, so now let me preface what I'm saying by saying that I spent many years getting sources declassified from the Clinton library. And also from the George H.W. Bush library. I also worked in Mikhail Gorbachev's papers, Francois Mitterrand's papers, extensive collections from Helmut Kohl in Germany, and so forth. So when I speak about the 80s and the 90s, I am doing so on the basis of research in high quality evidence. The George W. Bush library is not yet as well organized, and there is not as much evidence in the public domain. So when I speak about the 2000s and the 2010s, I don't have as much evidence, but there are some things that, some broad outlines of what happened that we can discuss. So during the George H.W. Bush and Clinton administrations, the question was how to enlarge NATO. And I've described to you this debate over whether to do it via this partnership for peace as a halfway house that would blur the line in the middle of Europe. But ultimately, the decision is to draw the new Article 5 line across Europe. And once that happens, then the next question is, how far will that line move? In other words, how far east will NATO enlargement go? And initially, the Clinton team thinks that the chances are very good that Vice President Al Gore will become the next president, and that many of them will, still stay in and be in the same jobs, and it'll be the same people running it. But of course, that doesn't happen. We have the controversial election of 2000, and ultimately the Supreme Court decides that election in favor of President George W. Bush based on rulings about Florida ending the recount there, which then ends the recount at a time when George W. Bush was in the lead. So you have this controversial election, and you have George W. Bush becoming president, and he then feels strongly that NATO should basically keep expanding without limit. So one of the reasons I called my book Not 1 Inch is that initially that refers to the controversy between President Mikhail Gorbachev and Jim Baker over whether or not NATO will move not 1 inch eastward. But I realized that by the late 2000s, 2010s, that phrase not 1 inch applied in a different way. it meant the view of George W. Bush that not 1 inch of Europe should be off limits to NATO, that it should be open-ended NATO enlargement. And this then runs obviously into friction with Moscow, but also into friction with European states who are concerned about the consequences if NATO does keep enlarging, for creating friction with Moscow. And so at the NATO Bucharest summit in 2008, there is a big fight between basically the Americans on the one hand and the Europeans, particularly the Germans, on the other, where the Europeans say, you know, it would be too risky, it would create too much friction with Moscow to put Georgia and Ukraine in NATO, so we should not do it. And the Americans feel very strongly the opposite way. They feel that Georgia and Ukraine should be in NATO. So there is a real disagreement. And so the result is a compromise, which is unfortunately the worst of all worlds. And I obviously don't need to tell you this, given what is happening to you. And so there's this compromise where even though NATO is not going to let Ukraine in, and as your questioner rightly pointed out, the first practical step in that process is something called the map, where a country gets basically an individualized program of the steps it needs to become a member. That's not going to happen, but as a bad compromise, the alliance issues a summit declaration saying, well, someday Ukraine and Georgia will be members. And this really is the worst of all possible worlds, because it's not honest on the part of NATO toward you, because even though NATO is saying, well, you will become a member, NATO is not doing anything to actually make you a member. I mean, I don't need to tell you this, you know all this, right? So there was no map, which is, the essential step to actually becoming a member. So in many ways, I think that was dishonest to say, well, you will become a member, but we're not actually going to do anything to make you a member. So then it creates, confusion, it creates false expectations. And also in Moscow, it also caused Putin to be very angry. And of course, then Putin started in 2008 by finding an excuse to take military action in Georgia. And then, of course, as you know, 2014 in Crimea, and now, of course, what is happening. And that essentially ends any chance of your country or Georgia becoming members, because the alliance does not like to take on a state with a pre-existing conflict on its territory. So, for example, Georgia in 2008, because of the Article 5 guarantee. The Article 5 guarantee that an attack on one member state will be treated as an attack on all. Putin, by basically doing what he did in Georgia in 2008, created this pre-existing frozen conflict, and that means the alliance doesn't want to take that on, because it is de facto taking on a conflict with Russia. So with what he did in Georgia in 2008, with what he did in Crimea in 2014, already there was very little chance that NATO was going to live up to that statement that Ukraine and Georgia would be members. And then once Putin began causing military conflicts in Georgia and in your state, then all chance of that basically evaporated. And I think it was in some ways dishonest of the alliance to pretend otherwise in public. And so this all comes out of this sort of bad compromise with President George W. Bush in the later 2000s. So that, I think, is a complicated history, and has unfortunately, given, again, we see a trend here. Putin takes, something that is a little bit accurate. So it is accurate that NATO declared that Ukraine would become a member. That is in the NATO summit declaration from 2008. But if you actually look at the broader picture, it's clear NATO did nothing to actually make Ukraine and Georgia members. Again, Putin takes a little bit that is accurate and then just ignores the rest and says, well, look, NATO clearly was going to put in Ukraine and Georgia immediately, no doubt about it. So therefore that justifies, I need to demilitarize Ukraine. So again, we see this pattern where he takes this little bit of history, but then just ignores everything that is counter to his view that, came afterwards. So that, I believe, is how that feeds in. So that's a very good question from your person in the chat.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Sure.
I think we have something like 5 minutes of your time, and there are so many questions. But one of them is quite big. I hope we can talk about it. Basically, this is a question about Yugoslavia and the fact that Russian population reacted quite specifically to the war in Balkans, and they have generated some sort of a special attitude towards NATO, specifically after the Balkan War. So can you just reflect on that. You talked a lot about Chechnya and other wars, but
Yes.
what was the role of Balkan War?
Well, Kosovo is obviously very important too, because Kosovo, the crisis there when Slobodan Milosevic is terrorizing Kosovar, Albanians, Muslims, that causes NATO to take a military action without the approval of the UN Security Council. And this happens just after Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic become members of NATO. And so again, this is another case where President Putin then says, well, look, NATO exists to bomb Slavs. And obviously it is correct that NATO bombed Serbia. But again, he ignores the humanitarian crisis created by Slobodan Milosevic that started that bombing. So that is a very important event where there is a clear deterioration in relations between Russia and the West. It's when the attack on in March 1999, well, the bombing actually goes on later, but that causes the Russian foreign minister to turn his plane around. He was on a trip to the US, he turned his plane around and went back. And that causes a lot of resentment in Moscow, and not just among the elites, but also among the population. As I said, this idea that NATO, without UN approval, is going to attack a sovereign country. And again, that's another piece that is useful to Putin to instrumentalize now. He can say, well, look, I did this. Putin can say NATO did this, so it may be doing this, to other countries. So that is another piece of this process where he is instrumentalizing pieces of history. So, we have, just 2 minutes left. So I actually be interested in hearing a little bit from you. Is this, is this history, is it helpful to you or interesting to you? Because, I just want to be as helpful as possible to you, given the situation that you're in. I mean, does it help to clarify some of the things that Putin is doing, or is this helpful to you?
This is very helpful, especially given the what is happening right now. And as you you pointed out that right now Putin and Russian media, they use quite a lot of justification. They evoke a lot of narratives to justify what is happening now. And it is very much important to have a very clear understanding of these narratives. Where do they come from? To what extent they're credible? How can we address this narrative with accurate historical facts and fact-checking? So all this has been incredibly useful, and I'm sure we will write down this as a transcript, and we will just share it, to the wider audience. And I guess we will translate it into both Ukrainian and Russian, so people can know more about the history. And
actually, one of my books, the one about the collapse, that book has appeared in Russian. So that book is available already in Russian, and so that contains a lot of this background. It was published by a publisher called Individuum, and that publisher actually recently wrote to me, a woman. She actually wrote to all the authors. She has chosen to leave Russia. She's no longer in Russia. So at least that book, The Collapse, is available, as I said, in a Russian version. Are you receiving, what kind, do you hear like the Russian propaganda? Do you hear Russian media as well? How much are you able to hear what people in Russia are hearing?
Yeah, so first of all, even before the invasion and even before the war, the first occupation of Crimea and Luhansk and Donbass, of course, we had a very extensive influence of Russian soft power here in Ukraine. First of all, Russian media used to be quite popular in Ukraine. And second, Russia used NGOs and educational institutions and even religious organizations as kind of tools of soft power. So quite a lot of intellectuals or Russian-speaking agents, politicians, heads of NGOs and think tanks, these people repeated these Russian narratives here in Ukraine, trying to convince Ukrainian population that they have some sort of a historic, deep connection with Russia, but not with European Union and not with NATO. And I think this argumentation has influenced Ukrainian political debate. It influenced it for many years. I think Ukrainian population itself was quite polarized. And in terms of political preferences, some people voted for candidates that were more pro-Russian versus those who were pro-NATO. And I think this political polarization was deeply influenced by these narratives. Right now, of course, Ukrainian population is way more unified because of this invasion and because of the occupation of Crimea and Donetsk and Lugansk. Nevertheless, in times of crisis and war, people often evoke emotional narratives, or people often talk past each other, and having the arguments which you presented actually is very helpful, because it brings us back to logic, to historical truths, to fact checking. So having this is very important. And right now, we are able to monitor Russian media sources. I read quite a lot of Russian social media just because I want to stay informed and alarmed. I think this is a part of my job as a social scientist, to learn what is happening. And I would say that all social media which I read now, they are full, they're just overwhelmed by these kind of narratives which you just presented. So basically, a lot of social media narratives, they justify this war. They actually present it as a very heroic event. And there is quite a lot of satisfaction in what I read, that so Russian social media now presenting the situation that NATO is not doing enough. NATO is not helping Ukraine and is betraying Ukraine. So sort of the narrative is that Ukrainians, they kind of wrongly would like to join NATO, but NATO is betraying Ukraine. So it is okay to punish them now by invading them. Sort of this is a very weird narrative, but that's what I see in social media, which I monitor.
Is your university are you able to at least have some classes by Zoom, or is it not become possible to do that?
It is possible. So our university is working. We just this week, we restored online Zoom classes for undergrad students. We don't yet have this for masters for various reasons. First of all, some part of our faculty is now engaged either as volunteers or even as members of territorial defense. But I can say the same about the students. Our students, master students, they're very much engaged in what is going on now. They're volunteers. They, they try to be helpful in their communities. So it's difficult for them to attend classes. But I think eventually we'll come back. And our faculty and other members of the university, we work as researchers. We advise to government, and we work on projects like these lectures, for instance.
Right. And you still have, it looks obviously, Zoom and communications possibilities, and are able to communicate.
Yes. So shortly, those territories that are not harmed, like Mariupol, for instance, or Chernihiv. These are very complicated cases. The cities are almost destroyed. So of course, it's not possible to work there. But there are other locations that are more safe, like Kiev or Lviv, and people stay there. We have access to internet. It's a war economy, but it functions. So the trains are running, groceries are working, internet is working. And we are able to maintain this sense of normality, but also we are able to work. And that's what quite a lot of Ukrainians are doing right now. There is this strong understanding that we need to work to keep our economy rolling, so we can support our army to win in this war.
Right. I remember reading histories of London in the Blitz and hearing from historical actors reading documents saying people in the Blitz, under the Nazi Blitz, felt that the best thing they could do, the thing that helped them the most, was just keep doing their normal life, to keep going to work, keep doing what they did, and that it helped them, despite all of the horrors they were experiencing, to just keep moving forward. So again, let me finish, since we're getting to the end of our time, to say how deeply honored I am to be asked to contribute to that cause. and to the effort that you have to keep normal life going under truly, truly horrific conditions. It was really a profound honor to be asked, and I'm glad to hear that this lecture was helpful to you in some small way.
Thank you very much, and you responded so quickly, and it's absolutely an honor for us to have you. And I will just finish with a quick note about another project which we are working on. So our team is also working on donation fundraising to help Ukraine with the humanitarian aid. I posted our link into the chat. We already managed to collect, to fundraise almost $12 million, and almost all this money are going to buy medical kits and bulletproof vests, mostly medical kits. And we're still doing that, and we will appreciate any support. So I appeal to our viewers to support Ukraine, to help us with humanitarian aid, and you can find our donation page if you just Google Key School of Economics. Our donation is registered in Washington, D.C., so you can pay with dollars, euro, crypto, and American organizations can have tax deductions. So that's it. Thank you for your support, and Mary, thank you again for being with us.
Sure. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.
Bye-bye.
Take care.